I hereby enter into evidence. No, I'm just playing. Though we will swing back to that. We have had the highly anticipated release of Taylor Swift's The Tortured Poets Department, which, as expected, was a win for the lit nerds, though in a much different way than I personally anticipated. And as Taylor herself says, he knows how to ball, I know Aristotle, so what a perfect opportunity to analyze the Tortured Poets Department through the lens of Aristotle's Poetics. Now, was this the video I saw myself making about this album? Absolutely not. But this is where my brain is sticking, and this is where I must indulge it. And I think there's a lot at play that is interesting through this lens. And while I'm not pretending it's a perfect transcription, I think there's a lot of really interesting insights by looking at the album through the lens of the Poetics, because after all, Aristotle himself says in the Poetics that poetry is more universal and history has to deal with particulars. And so we are looking at a history here in many ways, but we are looking at it through the lens of poetry and opening it up to that universality. And she has given us these songs that by the end have transmuted through alchemy, perhaps, into that more universal experience. And within Fortnight, the opening song itself, Taylor very quickly references being a functioning alcoholic, which is concerning for her mental health and well-being at the point of this album. But if we are looking at it through the lens of the Poetics, could also be interpreted as a calling upon Dionysus, who is the god of poetry, of theater, of music, and of tragedy. In fact, to steal a line that I am reading completely independently of the Tortured Poets Department, which we will hopefully be talking about more in depth on Friday, Glorious Exploits, it says about Dionysus, of all our gods, Dionysus was the only one he really cared for, the god of tragedy, wine, music, and madness, the only god to die and be reborn. Just an interesting thought. So there is the duality throughout this album, and sometimes potentially more than duality, but we are just looking at this one particular aspect. And since Aristotle himself was a notorious fanboy of Sophocles and held up Oedipus as the pinnacle of poetry, the pinnacle of tragedy and theater, let's steal a line from the Johnston translation of Oedipus that is oddly reminiscent of some of the communication we've gotten from Taylor in relation to this album, and that says, "I shall speak as one who is a stranger to the story, a stranger to the crime." There is this sense of laying out the evidence in many ways in this album, and in a lot of ways it makes us an active participant as listeners in the narrative, but more on that later. On top of that, while I will most probably be referencing the main 16 songs most directly within this, we will still reference songs from the anthology, and the song Prophecy itself is railing against this idea of fate, the idea of prophecy, similar to what we see in Oedipus. So there are these allusions, even when they are very opaque, and that brings us into this idea of tragedy. Now, before we jump all the way in, hi, I'm Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, and I am by trade trained in theater, dramaturgy, literary management, and so this kind of mental exercise, one, comes from having that in my background, but it's also then going to be rooted in that background. So I will be pulling primarily from the Project Gutenberg translation of the Poetics that is available free online, which I will link below, as well as my first semester theater aesthetics notes, because this is kind of the foundation that we are taught in terms of storytelling. If you have heard me talk about Aristotelian structure in any point of our time together, this is what I am referring back to in many ways. But aside from that, that's what we get up to here. If you enjoy this discussion today, I would love for you to interact with this video and potentially subscribe so that we could hang out more, but no pressure either way. But moving back to this idea of tragedy that we are kind of playing with in the ideas of the song Prophecy, but more particularly throughout the ideas of the album, It's almost a tragedy, says she, is what the poem that Stevie Nicks herself wrote for this album. And so we are playing with the idea of tragedy, and we throw the word tragedy around a lot. Taylor herself throws the word tragedy around in this album itself. And within the context of the album, it begs the question, is this a tragedy? Especially as there are these really darkly comedic moments on this record. But if we are considering it within the context of storytelling, absolutely. For one, if we're looking at the Poetics, generally what we are referring to when we think of Aristotelian structure is in relation to tragedy. Comedy is a little bit different, it's a little looser, it's not as well defined by Aristotle himself, and it is the imitation of the lower classes in many ways. Here, to be a tragic figure, to be playing in the realm of tragedy, you have someone who is at some height. There is some change, some fall, though it doesn't have to be a fall, that needs to be at play. And this album, and we'll get into it more later, really plays with the idea that Taylor feels like she has been placed on this pedestal that is incredibly isolating in a myriad of ways. And in many ways, that pedestal is directly playing into the tragedy. But then it also begs the question of, why isn't this potentially an epic? We have epic poetry. Taylor's life is epic in many ways to us as observers, but epic poetry is usually dealing with many plot lines and many threads. For instance, in the Odyssey, we are following Odysseus, but we are also following his wife Penelope and his son, whose name I cannot remember in this moment. And so there are many threads to follow. And within the album itself, it sets out this unity of time. It is not as straightforward and cohesive as Aristotle lays out in the Poetics, generally in relation to Aristotle, because this is not the case anymore, but the unity of time is generally around 24 hours is the ideal. Aristotle has a lot to say about episodic structure, or he has a little bit to say, and it is very sharp words about episodic structure. And in many ways, in a lot of ways, in all the ways, this album is inherently episodic, so I don't know what Aristotle would have felt about that. But again, we are just looking at it through the lens. But we start out with the song Fortnight, 2 weeks, as we know. And so while it is not 24 hours, it is still a very constrained amount of time. And I want to be clear, I know that the album is not taking place within this 2 weeks, but it is setting up this idea and putting some parameters around the thing that help kind of frame it in that way. Also, Fortnight is used most likely as a reference to those rascally romantic poets that we know Taylor likes from other allusions or direct references in other songs. So, okay, we have classified the Tortured Poets department as a tragedy. I don't think many people who have listened to the album would argue with that inherently. But what makes up a tragedy? And this is where I'm going to read to you directly, apologies, from my college notes. Thank you, Jen, which is a cut version of the Poetics directly. In this case, by cut, I mean we have potentially cut out some of the language, consolidated ideas to make it clearer to a freshman theater student. And I apologize because I don't know the exact translation here, but the way it's put together, I just think it is a little bit clearer than in the Project Gutenberg. And so what is tragedy? Tragedy, then, is the process of imitating an action which has serious implications, is complete, and possesses magnitude, by means of language, which has been made sensually attractive, with each of its varieties found separately in parts, enacted by persons themselves and not presented through narrative, through a course of pity and fear, completing the purification of tragic acts which have those emotional characteristics. That's a lot of words. To be fair, if you are here to break down a Taylor Swift album, you are used to a lot of words. And if you're here because you are a reader, you are also used to a lot of words. So there are a lot of ideas that we're going to get to throughout the rest of this discussion that are kind of summed up here. But tragedy itself is made up of 6 main parts. These main parts are separate from the action of tragedy, separate from plot structure, so to speak. Instead, plot is just one of the elements. The most important element, but an element nonetheless. I think one of the most important ideas here is action, that it's not just plot, It's not just character. Though plot is the most important, plot informs the character. So there has to be some kind of action taken to both move the story along and to reveal character. Again, this is looked at more specifically through a theatrical lens, but one, let's be clear, we know Taylor Swift is theatrical, and two, again, this is our main kind of framework in terms of the Poetics, and I do think that it is applicable to this album. And so we see Taylor taking a lot of action on this album. For good or ill, she is taking action, she is owning that action, whether it is messy or not, and that results in some of the tragic downfalls, perhaps, in some of the reversals. It is directly playing into the tragedy of the album is the action. Additionally, in relation to her character, we see her setting herself up as a tragic figure and not a victim. That is not how I mean that. In fact, she directly pokes at that critique and that interpretation multiple times in the album, but again, rather it is just going back to this idea of within tragedy, your hero has to be someone of magnitude. And so in songs like Clara Bow, as the most obvious, setting herself up in relation to these other icons. And so in songs like But Daddy I Love Him, we have the line, too high a horse for a simple girl to rise above it. And then in songs like Clara Bow, we are more specifically aligning Taylor amidst other giants of the industry, and amidst that, seeing the cost of that name to all of the women in the song and what the industry in whatever way has done to them, what being put on a pedestal has meant for them. This also plays into the idea from the Poetics that tragedies use real names because they are more credible. We see this in Clara Bow, we see this in the Tortured Poets department, and we will get into that a little bit more deeply when we go into the idea of character just a little bit more. And so now we have the hierarchy of elements of tragedy, which any theater student at least has been quizzed on and could surely tell you. And so again, we have in descending order, plot, character, idea, language, music, spectacle. So let's dive into all of these elements just a little more in relation to the Tortured Poets department, starting obviously with plot, which is also, I think, probably the hardest to conceptualize within the idea of an album. But I do think this album has a structure to it, and while it's not a clear, specific narrative in relation to A, B, C, and D happening in order, I think there still is an order. And again, also, we're not just talking about the structure of it, but also the idea that there is action in these songs, especially at the beginning, where we have a little bit more of the manic action or the sense of that mania, which again can swing us right back to Dionysus. But I would argue, and I'm not going to get into the structure of the beginning of the album, Down Bad could be the inciting incident, potentially, maybe. Argue in the comments and continue to argue in the comments, because here is where I think the ending structure in this album is. And I want to be clear that I could hear arguments either way on this, but I think, at least at this point, that LOML, Love of My Life, Loss of My Life, is the climax. I think this is where things ultimately change, come to a head in the album. And then I think I Can Do It With a Broken Heart is the falling action. I originally thought this was the climax, so I could probably hear arguments for this being the climax the easiest, but I have since adjusted my position, which leaves The Alchemy and Clara Bow as the new stasis, the resolution of the album. Of course, this again is only the first album. This isn't the second album, but that is where I see the clearest narrative being shaped. Of course, the manuscript does leave us in a very similar place, in a kind of closed chapter, kind of putting all of this to bed, but in some ways that feeds back into this idea of that being part of what makes it a tragedy, because now we are in a more universal experience through the magnitude of our tragic hero and Taylor being our tragic hero, which bridges us right into the idea of character within this album, which is so interesting because I feel like this is the angriest and like messiest Taylor has been in a second, and it's so raw and vulnerable, and she's willing to put that on display. But I also think it is incredibly important to remember that we are seeing her character in this as is directly relevant to the plot. So her actions are always going to be defined by that plot. And so we're not seeing the complete picture. We are seeing the picture related to this narrative. And within that context, there is the idea that this kind of action is more dramatically interesting. Taylor is, for better or for worse, again, unafraid to make choices on this album. And because everything works together, those actions are directly reflective or indicative of the ideas of the album, but it kind of goes back to the adage of actions speak louder than words. So we're getting both here, and we know that Taylor is good with her words, and so seeing those words and that language, which is further down on the structure as we laid out earlier, but we will get to defining that action and then revealing the ideas through that action. And so I don't think we really think of albums being active in terms of like framing it through the lens of plot or the Poetics. But I also think it's impossible to look at songs like But Daddy I Loved Him or Fresh Out the Slammer and not see the action there. And in that regard, maybe those are the inciting incident. Maybe that area of the album is the inciting incident because that is where the stasis changes. Again, thoughts below on that. But to tie it more directly into the Poetics, reading this bit from Aristotle about character in particular, it says, character is that which reveals moral purpose, showing what kind of things a man chooses or avoids. And so there is action in that dichotomy. Speeches, therefore, which do not make this manifest, or in which the speaker does not choose or avoid anything whatever, are not expressive of character. So it's easy to hide things behind words. It's the action that is going to reveal things. But that doesn't slingshot us into language. That slingshots us into what are the ideas that are being revealed by this action on this album. So think of this as like the theme of the album, the overarching idea of the album. What is the takeaway of this album? What is this album exploring? I personally think this album is really exploring and contending with this idea of fame at a certain level and seeking for genuine connection amidst living at a certain level. Listen, Swifties look at idea all the time. They are deep readers. They look into the meanings behind things. They're looking at the subtext. They're looking at what the action or the inaction in a moment is saying. In some ways, even looking at the album through the lens of the Poetics is an exploration of idea. And again, you don't generally write about ideas specifically, you write about action and character, and that reveals the idea. When you write about ideas more specifically, more on the nose, that is when things feel didactic. So again, going back to Clara Bow, which in many ways kind of like wraps up the ideas of the album, we are framing it through these women throughout history and their stories. And through that, we explore the price of stardom at a certain level and the search for genuine, true connection amidst that stardom, and ultimately asking the question of what the future looks like amidst that upon closing this chapter. But we are again exploring that idea through a framing device. Now, one of the tools we have in our tool belt in exploration of this idea is language, and Taylor is obviously very well known for her language, very well known for her lyricism, but I think what is really important to think about in relation to looking at this album through the lens of the Poetics is that for Aristotle, language was heightened. If we're looking at poetry at this time, theater at this time, verse at this time, we are looking at heightened language. And I think one thing people criticize Taylor for is her use of language in songs, and some people who are absolutely entitled to their opinions critique her use of big words. Now, as a fellow precocious millennial woman who read a lot to escape when I was younger and reads a lot now, her use of language and her vocabulary really appeals to me. But I think that in relation to this album album in particular, we are heightening the language on purpose, but we are also contrasting it more than we have ever contrasted it. This is the most explicit album we have ever had from Taylor. Again, we're going back to that rawness, a rawness that I think was very evident on Speak Now and Red. I mean, it's been there on all of the albums. I'm not here to analyze the discography, but I think there is something very unique at play here. And so amidst an artist who is very well known already for her heightened language, amidst a conceptual project that really is heightening that language, I think there is just as much intentionality at play in terms of contrasting that language. I think it is also important to note that language in relation to the Poetics is not just spoken word, it is also the subtext. So things like her voice break on So Long London could be considered language. There are things that inform character and action. When we can hear the anger on the album, especially in songs like But Daddy, I Love Him, that is nonverbal language. Now, what we as Taylor Swift fans are probably a little bit more familiar with in terms of language are her metaphor. Things like the alien abduction metaphor in Down Bad, or the kind of line between metaphor and allusion or intertextuality that we have in The Albatross, where we are, as expected, in direct conversation with Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and referencing the eponymous albatross. But those are also examples of language and how language is in play. So again, I think those metaphors and allusions are probably what we are more used to digging into, but I also think it is important to note, especially in context of the Poetics, that that nonverbal language still is at play, especially when digging into those little moments in fandoms can so often become twisted. And I'm not arguing that that can't spin a little out of control sometimes, but those moments are still part of the text. Which brings us to music, what we are here to talk about in the first place, but one of the least important things in relation to the Poetics. And I feel like I've heard the most critique in relation to the music. I'm not here to discuss that. I am no expert in music. Again, despite my name, it is in fact my brother who got the musical ability in the family. I but played oboe for a short time. But I think it is interesting in relation to the idea of the Poetics that the music really is one of the least important things. It is kind of a support to that language, to the ideas, to the action. And I personally am really enjoying the vibes of the music of the album, but I could understand people saying that the music falls to the background a little bit, and in many ways, I think that may be incredibly purposeful. I think that that may be kind of falling into the idea that the music is there for support on this album. Again, if we are looking at it through the lens of the Poetics, and we are only really considering it through that lens right now, it is not a perfect lens, but it's just one way to kind of look at and analyze what we've got going on here. And it's always interesting to think about things from different perspectives. And I think that that's a really interesting idea, that maybe that was a conscious choice to leave the music a little bit more bare bones. And I'm not saying it's not complex or it's not doing interesting things, but it's clear that this is a purging in some ways, in many ways, and I feel like that is more in line with the poetic concept than it first appears it is. And it also could tie into probably like even spoken word poetry to some extent, though I am by no means an expert on spoken word poetry. To be clear, I am also not an expert on the Poetics or Greek theater, but I at least know something. You know what I mean? I know enough for us to have this discussion. And then we get to the last element, spectacle, potentially one of the most contentious, because within the Poetics, it is the least important, but within modern art, we rely a lot on the spectacle. And I am not going to sit here and pretend to be above spectacle, because I am a woman who will cry at the use of a confetti cannon under the right circumstances. And the bar is low for right circumstances. I just want to be honest with you in this moment. And so how do we have spectacle on an album? And this is one of the things that really interested me in looking at this album through this framework, because I truly believe that Taylor has made herself the spectacle on this album, both through this kind of mania that exists especially on the first half, but also through some of the images she's invoking in the album itself. And it could be argued that some of these images are the spectacle in and of themselves, absolutely. But especially on the song But Who's Afraid of Little Old Me, we have this image of her coming down from the gallows and floating down the street. And in some ways, it is very reminiscent to me of the ending of Medea, where we have this promise or threat of Medea potentially driving this carriage led by dragons directly to us as audience members, and there is a spectacle there, or an implied spectacle, and we have that implied spectacle here, which brings us around in some ways to this idea of the tragic hero and the tragic flaw. So we talked about this a little bit in relation to character and this idea that the tragic hero has to be someone of renown or import. I think it's also interesting to note, though, within relation to the Greek tragedies, that a lot of these plays were about figures or stories that were already known in the public consciousness in some ways. That's part of the renown or the of note part of the character in a tragedy, not all the time, but many times. And so in a lot of ways here too, that is just one more piece supporting Taylor as a tragic hero, because she is of note, and here she is telling her own story, her own history, and claiming that narrative, which we have seen her do before, but just that we as the public already have some perception of her supporting the idea of her as a tragic hero, which brings us around to the idea of the tragic flaw. We are all probably familiar with the idea of a tragic flaw, usually something like hubris. With Oedipus, again, it is a little bit more complicated. It is a little bit more left to fate. It is the prophecy, again, in many ways. But I think that the idea of the tragic flaw in relation to the tortured poets department is interesting. One, again, because we've said again and again, this idea that Taylor isn't afraid to put her flaws on display in this album, to be messy, to make bold choices, and to own up to those bold choices. And in terms of those flaws, I think it's of note that her Instagram post from release day had this bit in it. It says, "And upon further reflection, a good number of them turned out to be self-inflicted." So there is this playing into this idea of the tragic flaw, of there being some ownership of whatever the outcome of this tragedy is. Now, am I going to sit up here and discuss Taylor Swift's tragic flaws? Absolutely not. I think that it is absolutely something that could be speculated upon, but I don't think that's the most interesting piece here. I think that Taylor taking ownership of the existence of those flaws is. I also don't think that that is an anomaly by any means, but I think that it is a little bolder here. And it also goes in to some of the anger and the conversations that I think that this album is having, again, with its listeners directly. We have entered the "Is this play about us?" portion of this analysis, because I have been playing with this idea, and again, this is just my interpretation, you could have a different read of it, but Taylor seems to be talking directly to someone on the album, whether it is us generally as listeners, her fans, a different group. There is a sense of there being a conversation there, and in terms of looking at it through the lens of the Poetics, I can't help but think of it framing us as the chorus of the album. So within a tragedy, we generally have a chorus, which is made up of people. There is generally the leader of the chorus, but the chorus is there to comment on the action. And there are moments within the album that directly reference choruses, whether it be the Christian chorus in Cassandra or the sanctimoniously performing soliloquies I'll never see in But Daddy, I Love Him. Those are both kind of referential to the idea of chorus, but then we have these kind of arguments almost that Taylor seems to be having with the chorus, with us. I don't know, but that again is why I'm interpreting it this way. And listen, choruses can be a little dramatic, but songs like But Daddy, I Love Him and Who Is Afraid of Little Old Me, while it could potentially be argued that they have different choruses, do seem like they are talking to the public more generally. I am more inclined to think that the chorus is more directly Swifties here. I have in the past been hesitant to kind of take on the mantle of that title just because I don't feel like I am involved in any communities or knowledgeable enough. But I think within the framing of the lead up to the album, how she has approached the conversation around the album as entering these things into evidence, it is kind of like she is putting herself on trial in some ways. And I know that the kind of aesthetics of the album have been a little different, I think, than what was initially anticipated, because I think dark academia was initially what was anticipated, especially with the poetry connection. But if we again go back to Oedipus and the choruses of Greek tragedy, these choruses are often presenting an alternate point of view to the tragic hero. They are arguing something with them. Or in Oedipus itself, there are a lot of lines that really invoke this idea of justice in whatever way, or something being justice for something, being put on trial for something. And if you know Oedipus, you know a little bit more about that. And so I think that that kind of positioning of the album may actually be referential to that. And in many ways, this idea of us as listeners, as the audience, as the chorus, kind of inspired this whole mental exercise, because I find it so compelling and so interesting. You don't have to agree with me. And again, this is but one interpretation, but I think it's a really interesting possibility. I think lines like, "I'll tell you something about my good name, it's mine alone to disgrace," from But Daddy, I Love Him, are especially illustrative of this. It feels like an argument, and I definitely also understand the sentiment, but that feels like it's in conversation. And again, choruses typically represent like the hopes, fears, and desires of a larger body, and this is a work that is seemingly directly in conversation and response to feeling the pressure of a large group, of being put on this pedestal and being at the height of something, but what the cost of that is. And so I think it is very possible that we then have a chorus that we are responding to. In that, it is not just a wholesale write-off of the chorus is directly part of the action and impacted by the decisions of the tragic hero. So it is still a relationship in a lot of ways, and I think that that adds another really interesting layer. Additionally, the Greek chorus often provides exposition or background information to the audience, and I think that this is an album that in many ways is very much in conversation with those who have been on this ride with Taylor for whatever duration. I think it's still very accessible. I think the emotions of the album are very accessible, but I do think that it feels incredibly personal in a multitude of ways as well that relate back to this idea of being a chorus. And if you have further thoughts on that piece, let me know. But what ultimately is the point, and what makes a good tragedy? And according to the Poetics, a good tragedy, through pity and fear, inspires a purgation of emotion, or catharsis. And we have a lot of pity and fear on this album, two different tenors. And to be fair, Taylor herself told us that we should fear her. And to be honest, she keeps dropping songs at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. I do fear her. I have a day job. And Aristotle himself tells us what kind of character best elicits pity and fear within the construct of tragedy. And based on the way that Taylor has positioned herself, especially on this album, it is very much in that realm, because we're talking about figures that exist between the two extremes. You know, they're not perfect, they're not righteous and just at all times, but neither are they living in the realm of pure vice. Rather, to again quote Aristotle himself, they just have human error or frailty. And I truly believe that within this album, Taylor is putting that human error and frailty on display. She is reminding us of those flaws in the pursuit of purging these emotions and leaving this chapter in the past. At the same time, to purge these emotions, to reach catharsis, we have to feel something. Now, I do think that this feels like an incredibly personal project in a lot of ways. Taylor is purposefully reminding us of her flaws in pursuit of that catharsis, and in order to reach that catharsis, we have to feel something. And at the same time, by turning herself into a tragic figure, Taylor is reminding us of her humanity. And while Aristotle, at least to my reading, acknowledges that the art bros consider epic poetry the superior art form, my editorializing, admittedly, Aristotle argues that tragedy achieves its ends more perfectly, and wouldn't you know, we are still fighting about it. But all we need to consider is whether tragedy achieves Taylor's end in the tortured poets department most perfectly. And with that kind of concludes my overarching thoughts about looking at this album through the framework of the Poetics. And listen, at the end of the day, I know it's not a perfect framework. I know this is an album, not a play, but I still think it is a really interesting, and I would argue important framework through which to consider this album, because I think it has the elements, and again, within the framework of how Taylor is presenting this album, especially in the physical releases, I think that, like in Oedipus, we are presenting a trial of some kind. And so at the end of the day, it is up to us as the presumed chorus to decide the verdict. But I am not the leader of this chorus, and I will be determining no verdicts decidedly. So you let me know what you're thinking, and I am very happy that you stuck around to hear my thoughts if you were still here. But with that, those are my thoughts. So like and subscribe if you feel like it, read something good, and yeah, bye.